Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the last in this year's Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies brings together faculty and students from law, legal theory and public law, political theory, constitutional level, empirical political science, and political and legal philosophy, to pursue a range of activities, both of an internal research character and of outreach toward students character, and has done since 2010. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of RGCS, as well as the director of the Jan P. Lind Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, of which RGCS is a part. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series aims to bring leading scholars to discuss their research on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in ways that are broadly accessible to a student audience and that aim to bring live research questions being seriously intellectually pursued to the attention of a student audience, hoping to overcome the traditional dichotomy between visiting talks by research-serious faculty who go talk to research-serious faculty at other universities and celebrity entertainer intellectuals who are trotted around at high honoraria to give the bread and circuses to undergraduates. Very fine scholars are typically very fine teachers, and today's speaker is no exception. And we invite serious researchers here and ask them to do their very high-quality teaching work about their current research. This is the end of the RGCS lecture series for the year. There is one more event in the Lind Center's major public programming that will be of interest to people in this audience. 2 weeks from today, the Jan P. Lind Center's annual lecture will be given by Elizabeth Anderson, professor of political philosophy at the University of Michigan. And that will be at this time in the faculty club. There are posters around. Registration is asked for if you are interested in attending Professor Anderson's lecture on neoliberalism and liberalism. Please register, and we will hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Our speaker for today is Teresa Bejan, Associate Professor of Political Theory and Fellow of Oriel College at the University of Oxford, previously Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and a Fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia University. Professor Bejan holds a PhD in political science from Yale University, and her dissertation was awarded the Leo Strauss Prize from the American Political Science Association for the best dissertation in political philosophy and theory. She has been the Balazan Skinner Fellow in Modern Intellectual History at Cambridge. She's the author of articles in many of the leading journals of the discipline. She's been a conference organizer and intellectual convener on a major new intellectual development in bridging the gap between the study of Rawls and Rawlsian political philosophy and historical approaches. And she is the author of Mere Civility. Mere Civility was the subject of an extended online symposium at the Immanent Frame, which is the website about religion and secularism sponsored by the Social Science Research Council, of a review symposium in the Review of Politics, and of reviews in venues including the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as of interviews, podcasts, and even, I think this might be a first for one of our RGCS lecturers, of a TED Talk. Mere Civility is historically rich, controversial, sometimes scandalous, frequently very funny, deeply curmudgeonly, and genuinely wise. It's a really extraordinary book of a sort that it genuinely hadn't occurred to me before reading it someone could write as a first book in political theory. It has the world-weary air of somebody who's been fighting foolish arguments for a very long time. But it does a tremendously effective job at fighting foolish arguments and at weaving a sophisticated account of what is needed in speech and in free speech together through an account of what contestation looked like about religion and discussions of religion in the 17th century, through a highly engaging argument with and about Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, whom she rightly views as the villain of the piece, and Roger Williams, about whom she gives a significantly novel interpretation relative to the received niceness account in the literature. One of the most delightful things about the book is how deeply skeptical it is of niceness. And for a book that's titled Mere Civility, it's a book that's very surprising about what it is you find in it. It's a call not to niceness, not to burying disagreement, not to suppressing disagreement, and not to trying to make our disagreements be nicer than they are, but rather a call to go on disagreeing with each other, knowingly and intentionally, if sometimes contemptuously, insultingly, and scandalously. Today she will be introducing us to her next major research project, and her lecture is entitled Equal Speech in Public.
Thank you, Jacob. That was characteristically and incredibly kind. And thanks to Nina and the Yan P. Lin Center for their tireless efforts in getting me here. And also thanks to all of you for coming, firstly. And secondly, for bearing with me as I negotiate an unfamiliar technology. But unfamiliar technology will be one of the themes of the lecture. So today I propose to you to speak about equality and speech, or more precisely, the principle and practice of what I call equal speech in public. And I base this idea on a forgotten but really fascinating concept from ancient Greek, the term isagoria. Ah, it works. Okay. Isagoria is associated with the theory and practice of democracy in ancient Athens. The prefix iso, meaning equal or even, and the root agorein, meaning something like public address. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. Anyway, I say that this concept of equal speech is forgotten because the concept of isagoria, of equal speech in public, has been crowded out in favor of its more attention-seeking cousin, free speech, or freedom of speech, a topic with which all here, I'm sure, are well familiar and probably more or less exhausted. Indeed, in modern English, isagoria is often translated as freedom of speech, even though there is another more famous Greek term meaning precisely that, namely parasia. And as you'll see on my beautiful slide, that's from the Greek pan plus rhesis, meaning literally all saying. So a parasiastes is literally a say-it-all. And it reflects the willingness to speak one's mind, to speak freely and frankly, truth to power, without fear or favor, whatever the danger. And fittingly, Michel Foucault made parasia the subject of a series of lectures towards the end of his life at Berkeley, which was then published posthumously as the book Fearless Speech. Anyway, as I've argued elsewhere, the fact that these two very different ancient terms are both routinely translated alike as freedom of speech is a problem, because it obscures what I think is actually a really important conceptual distinction between equal speech on the one hand and free speech on the other, as well as the very different principles and practices with which they were associated in classical Athens, as well as their legacies thereafter. And so today, I plan to give you a break from freedom of speech, after an initial excursus on the depredations of free speech discourse today, I plan to leave it behind entirely in favor of equal speech. And in recounting the forgotten history of isagoria, not only ancient but early modern, because as Jacob mentioned, I'm actually an early modernist, I hope that you'll agree that this history is not only interesting in its own right, but that the principles and practices of equal speech I'll describe to you can possibly shed some important light on the interminable, increasingly heated controversies about free speech in this country and also my own, the United States, and also the United Kingdom, where I now live and work. Anyway, I think that is certainly a topic that's in desperate need of more light than heat. And I hope to provide just a little bit of that light today. All right. Before I get to equal speech, I will have to spend some time and a few words on free speech. So, to inhabitants of liberal democracies today, few freedoms seem more obvious and ours. If one consults the great human rights documents of the 20th century, including the Canadian Charter, the right to free speech or expression is presented as fundamental, indeed as the most fundamental but one of our fundamental rights. And indeed, Americans tend to assume that the freedom of speech comes first in the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Of course, that's not true. It also comes second. But that was ratified as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. But of course, you'll see here that religious liberty comes first in all of these lists, and I can talk a bit more about why that's the case later on. In any case, political theorists also tend to put free speech first as well. So for John Rawls, freedom of speech was always among the basic liberties, and for Ronald Dworkin, freedom of expression always got pride of place. And for many theorists, the freedom of speech is so essential because they see it as what makes a democratic society fundamentally democratic, because democracy relies on giving people a voice or a say in how they are to be governed. So to borrow a phrase from Elizabeth Anderson, who will be here in 2 weeks, democracy is fundamentally about two things. It's about talk and votes. So that is of deliberation, debate, and expression in the public sphere, as well as voting in the ballot box. So democracy demands that the people be free to speak, and when they speak, to be heard. So for many theorists, free speech is also fundamentally what makes democratic societies free or liberal, as the right most closely tied to the protection of individual autonomy, if you're Tim Scanlon, or moral responsibility, if you're Dworkin. And even that high priest of liberalism, John Stuart Mill, offers a consummate expression of this view in the introduction to On Liberty. Right? Should be familiar to you. So as Mill makes explicit in the first chapter to On Liberty, but as many an undergraduate seems to forget, Mill's point is that the freedom of thought and discussion is exempted from the harm principle, precisely because it touches on our most fundamental interests as individuals and of mankind as a progressive being. As he puts it in the quote on the slide, quote, "The liberty of expressing and publishing opinions is practically inseparable from the freedom of thought and liberty of conscience, and so it must be granted the same absolute protection, not only from the state, but also from society." And indeed, of course, Mill's point in On Liberty is that at the time he was writing, 1859, he assumed that as a matter of political right, freedom of speech was uncontroversial. Right. What mattered was to defend this farther social right, the freedom of speech against society. So that means both from prior restraints and also from post hoc punishments. So of course, Mill's view, the idea that you would demand someone to be fired or deplatformed because they said something offensive would be utterly abhorrent. And so I think Mill would likely be shocked by many of our controversies over free speech today, from the ubiquitous deplatforming and no platforming debates on university campuses, and of course, as a navel-gazing elite, I can't help but navel gaze, but also to issues about hate speech and religious insult, as well as the politics of pronouns and gender identity and inclusion. And who could forget fake news and fears about the power of social media to amplify certain voices over others, which leads quite naturally to the thought of a kind of rectificatory justice concern. And so the idea that you might want to privilege some voices as a kind of compensation for the priority of other voices. And of course, this is a thought that's captured by the Me Too movement in the slogan, "Believe Women." Right? So the problem is that in such controversies, an appeal to freedom of speech alone does nothing to clarify, let alone resolve, the disagreement at stake, which is why perhaps political theorists and jurists have become much more willing than they once were to confess that the modern theory and practice of free speech is quite simply a mess. So while some civil libertarians continue to pine for the good old days, whether they be the 1960s or the 1920s, when the freedom of speech was the unapologetic emblem of the progressive left, some continue to trace a direct line from the First Amendment to the creation of modern free speech jurisprudence, and then finally the founding of the ACLU in 1920. Other scholars, though, have finally begun to point out that even in America, things have always been a bit more complicated, and gasp, that ideas of free speech predated the First Amendment. And, more crucially still, not all the world is America. And that theorists' determination to continue to frame questions of freedom of speech implicitly on the model of the First Amendment is at best inapposite and at worst, frankly, absurd. So noticing this should also alert us to some fundamental ambiguities, though, at the level of our concepts when it comes to what free speech is actually about. Right. As Ashutosh Bhagwat has tirelessly pointed out, even the text of the First Amendment itself, which of course, like most such documents, ended up being a grab bag product of revision by committee rather than Holy Writ, makes an important distinction between speech on the one hand and press on the other. But of course, James Madison's draft proposal makes the distinction even more sharply, as well as distinguishing between the people's right to speak, to write, and to publish their sentiments. So these three distinct rights, in contrast to the freedom of the press. As Bhagwat notes, the phrase freedom of speech, adopted in the final document, manages to efface these important distinctions between the spoken, the written, and the printed word, very different modes of communication that were also distinguished by the size and the distance of the audiences that they could reach with the technologies available. For the spoken word, the primary technology of communication and amplification was, of course, the speaker's platform, which the Athenians called the bema. For the written word, it could be conveyed through handwriting or the printing press. And noticing this helps us to see just how modern technologies have farther eroded and collapsed the distinctions that have been essential historically for carving out and delimiting a space for freedom in the realm of speech. So distinctions between platform and press, between speech and writing, between word and deed, between public and private, etc. So we call social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook platforms in a quaint callback to that ancient technology. But today I think they actually operate a lot more like presses. They reproduce and disseminate the written word and image with inscrutable algorithmic oversight. And on top of that, every private communication has the potential to go instantaneously public, which always reminds me of the complaint of Plato, Socrates, and the Phaedrus, that when words go orphaned into the world in the form of writing, mischief inevitably ensues. But of course, breakthroughs in communications technology are always followed by a sense of crisis. As Jacob mentioned in my book, I talk about the advent of the printing press, but we might just notice before the internet, there was broadcast, radio, and television, which amplified and transmitted the spoken word and image, and before that, the telegraph, too. But the final point I want to make here is that in this sense, these sort of new technologies of communication, these breakthroughs and their attendant crises, are just simply exacerbating an earlier conceptual confusion and collapse. First, in the expansion of the category of speech to include not only the spoken, but the written and the printed word, as well as nonverbal communication. But secondly, with the advent of the disastrous catch-all category of expression, enshrined in the UN Declaration, the European Convention of Human Rights, and indeed the Canadian Charter, which I think was a truly regrettable development of the 19th century that has been the cause of much ill. Anyway, as Honora O'Neill has pointed out, this resort to the language of free expression as an individual right has only further contributed to this kind of emptying out of our ethical and political discourse, and also of our imagination. By narrowing our ethical concern to rights as claims made by individuals and enforced by the state, and then wiping away the recipients of our speech entirely, that is, the audience of our speech, both actual and potential, intended and accidental. And so this move has further encouraged what Josh Cohen has called minimalist defenses of free speech, namely those that deny the importance or the power of our words, picturing them as somehow, quote unquote, harmless, to use Kant's adjective, by characterizing speech as merely the external expression of our thoughts or our ideas. And that kind of minimalist account breeds in turn a kind of irresponsible solipsism that treats speech as not even primarily communicative, but as a matter of self-expression, in which other people are required to be present in order to give us an audience, a passive audience for whom to perform our self-fashioning or self-display, but on the other hand, of whom we can become deeply resentful when their response is anything other than affirmation or unadulterated praise. As audience members, we too sort of shift. We feel a corresponding right not to respond discursively to the displays that confront us, but simply to react, often by being outraged or offended, and then to express our outrage and offense in turn, right? Such, it seems to me, is the state of free speech or free expression today. Rinse, repeat, no light, lots of heat. Right. It's a sorry state of affairs, and no wonder we appear to be getting increasingly nowhere for all of our incessant talk about freedom of speech. And for many free speech fundamentalists, of whom I would still count myself, actually, appeals to the principle of free speech increasingly reduced to a kind of license to offend, to say what you like, when you like, where you like, and to whom. And this sounds a lot like parrhesia as practiced in ancient Greece by philosophers like Diogenes the Cynic, known among other things for living in a barrel, masturbating in public, and telling Alexander the Great to get out of his light. What he saw as speaking truth to power, and what his neighbors saw as deliberate offense and being a jerk. And so for those disgusted and disillusioned with such arguments today, I think it can be tempting to give up on free speech entirely. But many of the most vocal critics of free speech fundamentalism nowadays insist that that's not actually their aim. Rather, they argue that denying hateful or historically privileged voices a platform, whether through deplatforming or through restrictions on hate speech, is necessary to make the equal right to free speech effective so that the most marginalized and precarious members of society can nonetheless speak up and be heard. In making that case, philosophers like Ray Langton, Ishani Mitra, and Mary Kate McGowan are reviving feminist and critical race arguments from the 80s and 90s that initially drew on J.L. Austin's theory of speech acts to understand the harm in pornography. Foremost here, of course, was the work of Catherine MacKinnon, who argued in Only Words in 1993, quote, "Words and images are how people are placed in hierarchies, how social stratification is made to seem inevitable and right, and how feelings of inferiority and superiority are engendered." And from this, MacKinnon concluded, and this is the quote on the slide, that sexist and racist speech acts not only degrade and demean, but silence on the basis of gender and race. As she put it in 1987, quote, "Any system of freedom of expression that does not address a problem where the free speech of men silences the free speech of women is not serious about securing freedom of expression." So on this view, if not for MacKinnon herself, actually, but for many of her followers today, things like hate speech laws and deplatforming are therefore themselves justified by a commitment to equal liberty, equal free speech. Certain voices must be silenced so that others can be heard, and so that free speech for all can be made effective. So noticing this, you might just think, okay, well, for all this talk about speech acts and silencing, what's at stake really is that age-old distinction between freedom and equality in a different form. So, to paraphrase Isaiah Berlin, quote, "Liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness. If I lose my freedom of speech in order to lessen inequality, an absolute loss of liberty occurs. Either we're free and unequal, or equal but unfree." But I think that sort of move to say it's just the freedom and equality tension, I think, again, is a little bit too quick. As I've suggested elsewhere, I think that these modern arguments are actually recalling a more ancient conceptual distinction and also a conceptual tension, and of course the forgotten concept of equal speech or isogoria. And I think that if we look to that concept, and if we recover this history of a principle and a practice, I think that can help us to approach contemporary controversies over speech with fresh eyes, or so at least I submit to you. You, my audience, will judge. To start with, recovering the principle of equal speech in public as an alternative to free speech or free expression, I think at the very least promises some conceptual clarity. Because you see, for all its promise of bringing mathematical precision and self-evidence to our considerations of justice, an appeal to equality alone doesn't actually clarify very much. So we might think of equal speech as the principle that equals should be treated equally, and therefore they are entitled to equal shares of speech, as of anything else. But even if we grant that principle, there are still questions about what exactly we mean by equal, both as a principle of distributive justice and as a premise. So let's start first with the principle. As any mathematician will tell you, at its most basic level, equality describes a relationship between two or more objects, quantities, or values. But that relationship actually has to be defined. It's not self-evident. Do we have any mathematicians in the room? Thank you. This is very sad. Equality is a relationship that has to be defined. Okay. One possible relationship, and I think the one that we think of most intuitively, is the relationship of equality as identity or sameness, in which two things are the same with respect to quantity or quality. In the case of speech, we might think of equality as identity as requiring mathematically equal shares of speaking turns, right? Everyone gets an equal number of turns, or of equal time. Everyone gets the same amount of airtime. Or else we might think that equality as identity demands an equal, as in the same opportunity for speech, with every person possessing an equal right or claim to speak, should they so choose. But of course, there's also an alternative sense of equal justice as a principle of balance or proportion. So for those readers of the Nicomachean Ethics present, and I'm sure that's more than mathematicians in an audience like this, right? But this is what Aristotle calls geometric equality, right? The principle that goods should be distributed equally to equals and unequally to unequals. In the case of speech, we might think of it as follows. If there's limited access to the conditions of speech, whether of time or access to the platform, access should be distributed proportionately according to some relevant criterion, however so determined. Now, of course, to a modern audience, that doesn't sound like equality at all. That just sounds like a kind of post hoc justification for, self-styled elites to take up all the speaking time. And that's fair enough, right? In practice, the criteria usually ends up being something like wealth, experience, age, or what the Greeks call virtue, including things like good birth and beauty. But we might think that there are good egalitarian criteria as well on which we can distribute the opportunity to speak. Principles of need, perhaps, affected interest, or something like diversity, the idea that we want representation for those of underrepresented races, religions, genders, etc. But things get even more complicated when we turn to consider equality as a premise of distributive justice. So equals should be treated equally, right? But what do we mean by equals? Here, I think we have three options as opposed to two. First, again, we have that intuitive idea of equality as sameness. We might consider persons as equal in virtue of the same characteristic that makes them qualitatively or quantitatively identical. So, for example, persons are equal as individuals, as citizens, as members of the same species, etc. As such, no one should count for more than any other one. We might say that that's the bedrock egalitarian principle. But notice that that principle, as stated, is vulnerable to what's called the leveling down objection. That is, that condition of no one counting for more than one, no one counting for more than any other one, can be satisfied by treating everyone equally badly, or as equally worth less. And so the premise of equality as sameness says nothing about why equals should count for something, rather than for nothing. And that seems to be a feature, not a bug, of that premise. Now, if for those listening think that that's unattractive, trying to hold this while drinking at the same time, don't worry, we have some other options. We might think of persons as equal by virtue of some unity between them, whereby each is an equal part or representative of some greater whole. So think what might, in terms of wholes, think the people, the church, the 99%. So equality as unity may sound metaphorical or quasi-mystical, and I'll argue that it is, but it grounds a claim to equal value of persons. It's actually much stronger than that of mere sameness. The whole cannot be ignored. It deserves a hearing, but it can speak only through its parts. But finally, and I think the most interesting idea of equality is equality as parity. So persons are equals if they are different and yet similar enough to be comparable or commensurable, and so to be considered as on a par. On this view, individuals of comparable worth or value count as peers or equals, even if they're not identical. Think of this as a kind of leveling up version of equality. Equality as parity sees persons as equally of worth or positive value, and thus places them on a shared level of a high status or rank. And so the concept of parity is probably less familiar to those of you in the room than the others, but I think it's a really crucial concept. And in my new book project, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to recover the concept of parity and clarify the work that it does in historical theories and practices of equality. If you're interested in parity, Ruth Chang is doing a lot with it in the context of ethics and evaluative judgment. And I also think it's implicit in a lot of contemporary discussions about dignity, as what Jeremy Waldron calls a range property. So Waldron says he's talking about equality. I actually think he's talking about parity. Applied to people, parity describes an equality of rank or status between those who are sufficiently similar to be comparable, but among whom, nevertheless, might persist differential degrees of dignity. So here, the clearest example is if we think about the Roman emperor as primus inter pares, first among peers. Turning back now to isogoria, I think it should be clear that depending on how we define it, a principle so seemingly simple as equal speech can issue in very different demands and very different practices and institutions. And so in the second half of the lecture, I'm going to illustrate this by appealing to two different historical examples, beginning with isogoria itself as a principle of equal public address in the ancient Athenian democracy, and then fast forwarding 2,000 years to a very different context, but one in which a principle of equal speech, I argue, was also central. And that is, of course, the context of the Quaker meeting as it developed in 17th century England. You might call this historical selection eclectic. I think it's pretty enlightening, though. These historical cases can, I think, help bring much needed analytical clarity and insight to contemporary controversies. And I'm going to gesture towards a few concrete ways in which they can do that at the very end. All right. The term isogoria dates back to the 5th century BCE, although modern historians still disagree as to when the practice of permitting any citizen who wished to address the Athenian ecclesia or democratic assembly actually began. As we've seen already, despite the common English translation as freedom of speech, the Greek isogoria literally means something more like equal public address. And I say that because the verb agorein, from which it derives, shares a root with the word agora, or marketplace. That is a public place where people gather together and talk. And of course, that includes philosophers like Socrates and their poor, hapless victims. So in the democracy of Athens, the idea of an informal gathering in the agora carries over into the more formal setting of the ecclesia or assembly, which convened regularly on the top of a hill in Athens called the Pnyx. Right? And so here we have a lovely artist illustration from the 19th century. For those interested in learning how to give PowerPoint presentations, the British Museum has an amazing catalog of images online. You could just spend hours on there, and you can use them all if you ask permission. So get the hence. If you get nothing else from this talk, it's an amazing resource. Anyway, so how did isogoria work? Well, the herald would ask, who will address the assemblyman? And then the selected volunteer would ascend the bema, or speaker's platform, and you can see that here. That's the bema. In theory, isogoria meant that any Athenian citizen had the right to participate in debate and try to persuade his fellow citizens. In practice, however, the number of participants was fairly small, limited to the practiced rhetoricians and elder statesmen sitting near the front. And disqualifying offenses included things like prostitution and taking bribes. We tend to forget it, of course, but Athens was not the only democracy in the ancient world. We think of Athenian democracy as somehow paradigmatic because it's the one for which we have the best evidence. But part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is Isagoria really makes Athens different to what other democracies are doing. From the beginning, Isagoria is seen as something special. Indeed, Herodotus is going to describe the form of government at Athens not as democratia, but as Isagoria itself, which again suggests that the Athenians were doing something different. According to the 4th century orator Demosthenes, the Athenian constitution was based on speeches and arguments, so politeia and logos. And its citizens had chosen, he says, they've chosen Isagoria as a way of life. For its critics, of course, this was a bug as well as a feature. So the so-called old oligarch or pseudo-Xenophon complains that even slaves and foreigners enjoy Isagoria at Athens, which meant that one could not freely beat them as one might elsewhere. Of course, you'll see in a moment that critics like the old oligarch are exaggerating for common effect. It's not the case that slaves enjoyed Isagoria at Athens. But still, it does suggest something true, which is that for Isagoria, the principle is fundamentally one of equality. And as such, it becomes the hallmark of Athens as a democracy, which distinguishes itself from other Greek polis, not by excluding women and slaves from citizenship, as did every society in human history until very recently, but because Athens included the poor, right? Working Athenians who could not afford armor and thus worked as sailors and rowers in the fleet were allowed to be citizens and to participate and speak in the public assembly. That's what's radical about Athenian democracy. And Athens even takes positive steps to render this equality of public speech effective by introducing pay for the poorest citizens to attend the assembly and serve as jurors in the courts of law. So taking a step back, I want to consider now the practice of Isagoria as I've described it to you from the standpoint of the conceptual distinctions that I introduced just a little bit earlier, and the different understandings of equality as both a principle and a premise of distributive justice. So here we have a modern photograph of the Pnyx and the Bema from another angle. As I've described it to you, we can see Isagoria as involving both principles of distributive justice, of equality as identity and also equality as proportion, right? All of the assemblymen gathered in the ecclesia have an equal or identical claim to agorein, to ascend the platform and gain a hearing. But due to scarcity of the conditions of speech, mainly in the form of time constraints, business usually had to be concluded within one day, and only one person could occupy the platform at a time, not as a condition of just physical space. You can get more than one person up there, but as a condition of, as a sort of compossibility constraint. Only one person can exercise their right to agorein at one time, right? If they're going to speak and be heard. So opportunity for access to the platform and exercise of the right to equal speech was thus distributed proportionately on the basis of age, experience, and rhetorical skill, which of course in Athens as elsewhere was kind of a proxy for either wealth or free time, which of course are the same thing. Anyway, but what about as a premise of distributive justice? Well, I think this is where the real action is, although it may not be immediately clear. All right, so often in discussions of Athenian democracy, one hears theorists and historians treating the relevant egalitarian premise as one of sameness, right? Athenians are equal in virtue of being citizens. But of course, that is not actually what's going on. Because, as we've seen, plenty of citizens were excluded from the right of Isagoria. Not only citizens who are children, so we might think that's an easy case, but citizens who are women, right? Aristotle tells us that silence may well be the glory of a woman, but he also notes that women are half the citizen body. But also excluded from isogoria were male citizens convicted of certain offenses, namely prostitution and taking bribes. And I'll just simply note that, of course, the problem with prostitution is that a man who allows himself to be penetrated sexually has made himself like a woman, and so is better off being silent and has surrendered his citizen privileges. Okay, so even if all adult Athenians were equally citizens of Athens, they were not all equally entitled to isogoria. Okay, well, what about unity? So many modern democratic theorists, especially theorists of deliberative and epistemic democracy, have drawn on Athens and the democratic practices of the ecclesia and the jury courts as some of the purest practical expressions of the democratic principle, namely that in democracy, the people, or demos, rules, because its members have an equal say or voice in collective decision-making. And so this, of course, is the idea behind voting. And it explains why in many languages the word for voice and the word for vote are either the same word or else they're cognates. It's tempting thus to think of isogoria as a further expression then of this principle of having a say as a member of the demos. Isogoria allows members of the demos to have a say in how they're governed in a way that goes beyond a mere vote. On this view then, isogoria operates on a unity premise. The voices of assemblymen count, that is, they are worthy of a public hearing, as representatives of the people. And so here you might want to think of Aristotle's description of the demos as a giant man with many ears, many eyes, etc. But now we're just going to add a big fat mouth, right? And when the people speaks through its members, it's like hearing the voice of God. So as I've said, this thought is tempting, but I think it risks conflating the two elements of democracy I mentioned earlier, namely talk and votes. And I think that this is brought out just beautifully by Melissa Schwartzberg in her masterful book, Counting the Many. And now I'm going to crib liberally from Melissa. There's an important difference between the ubiquitous democratic or popular practice of voice voting and the peculiar practices of the counted ballots and indeed of isogoria in the Democratic Assembly of Athens. So as Melissa points out, voice voting or acclamation does indeed operate on a premise of unity. As she puts it, quote, such mechanisms effectively capture the notion of a community speaking univocally. And the demos was allowed to speak, thus, even in oligarchic or mixed constitutions like that of Sparta. So other constitutions that are not strictly speaking democratic have a role for this kind of democratic voice voting participation. So in Sparta, the pre-selected candidates for the Senate or Gerousia, so like the body of elders, would be elected on the basis of whoever was greeted by the loudest shouts from the crowd as they passed through the assembly. And so individual Spartans could count, but they counted as members of the demos, and they made their voices heard by adding their shouts to those of their fellows in the crowd. But I think the idea of equality as unity expressed through voice voting is actually very different to that which informs the general practice of counted ballots and that comes to define the ecclesia and its practice of isogoria. As Schwartzberg argues, the practice of counting votes, so aggregation as opposed to clumping votes of acclamation, is a way of conferring epistemic dignity on those rendering decisions. And that's because it singles people out as counting, as being worthy of considering their individual and independent judgment. It gives weight to each individually. And so Schwartzberg, of course, is primarily concerned with voting, but I think the same thing applies to isogoria. Both ballot voting and isogoria are premised on the idea of equality as parity, in which each assemblyman, hoi bolimenos, regardless of wealth, education, or background, has the same claim not only to speak, but to be heard, not as a representative of the demos, but in his own right. And to repeat, I think that's what's truly radical about Athens. It's in allowing poor male citizens not only to vote, but to speak publicly and to hear and judge other speakers in turn, which elevates them to the status of epistemic peers, not just equals, but peers. Their voices have worth and weight, and that weight is comparable even if it's not identical. So I'm going to turn now to my second example because I'm conscious of time drawing to a close. But I think I just want to point out two features of equality as parity. This might all sound okay. I see some people nodding, right? This sounds right. You think I'm right. This is great. You're great. I'm right. This is how equality works in Athens. But note that equality as parity, the idea of some voices counting, is predicated on other voices not counting. Those who count can be readily distinguished from those who do not, those who are excluded from public debate. So not only slaves, resident foreigners, convicted prostitutes, but of course, women and female citizens. And so I think that there's a tendency for scholars partial to Athenian democracy to treat such exclusions as blind spots or historical baggage that can be that don't materially affect the theory. And I'm looking at you, Josh Ober. But I think that's actually far too quick. It's fair to say that the value of isogoria for those who possessed it was predicated precisely on the knowledge of those who were excluded from it. In order for my voice to have weight, others must be weightless. In this case, men's speech depends on women's silence. But of course, isogoria, as premised on parity, also opens up a possibility of voices from the margins, nevertheless to be heard. If in the case where there's a voice that's more than merely equal, external to the ecclesia, and of course I am talking about prophecy and prophetesses. Right, so of course here we have an image of the Pythia, the priestess of the Temple of Apollo at the Oracle of Delphi. Right, the idea is that certain women's voices could be heard if they could claim epistemic privilege, or better yet, authority, that would give their voice more than equal weight. And of course, in the case of the Pythia, the idea was that she was intoxicated or overwhelmed by the spirit of Apollo, and that then her words would be interpreted by the male priests, of course. And so through that way, her voice counted much, much more than did the voice of any Tom, Dick, or Yorgos sitting quietly in the back of the ecclesia, right? And so this suggests that the parity premise that underlay the practice of isogoria in Athens could accommodate marginal voices so long as they were exceptional and external, from those who were not equals, but in some way superiors. And that superiority was okay, so long as those superiors could be kept safely away from the organs of democratic government. Right. So I think we can understand even better the importance and the peculiarness of the parity premise in Athens by comparing it to a similar practice of equal speech in a very different setting. One might wonder, right, what becomes of isogoria in the world when the democratic institutions that give rise to it disappear. So one reason, I think, just historically why we tend to talk about free speech much more than we talk about equal speech is because of its institutional dependence. With the decline of the ecclesia as a democratic assembly, the corresponding concept of isogoria fades away, while the concept of paresia, as a kind of free or frank speaking of truth to power, continues both among Christian, evangelical Christians in the Roman world, but also as the characteristic licentia of speech, a kind of rhetorical trope practiced by advisors or counselors to kings. And so finally, when we get something like isogoria coming up again, it's in the context of frankly aristocratic or elite deliberative bodies, like the British Parliament, right? The idea that members of Parliament enjoy a kind of privilege of debate. We can see this as a form of isogoria, but it's returned to its kind of elite form as opposed to the democratic form that we saw in Athens. But of course, along with the disappearance of the ecclesia as a democratic assembly in which all members had the right to speak, that didn't put a stop to questions about assemblies in general. And who had a right to speak in them. Of course, the Greek term ecclesia was adopted by the authors of the New Testament to describe assemblies of Christians, i.e. the church. And St. Paul, in his letters to the Corinthians, suggested that in the days of primitive Christianity, something like Athenian isogoria had reigned. And so that's why Paul is taking such pains in 1 Corinthians to specify how and who exactly should be permitted to speak in church. Anyway, and so those debates about the meaning of Corinthians, in which none other than John Locke weighs in 1704, provide the backdrop for this final site of isogoria. So I want to talk about the Quaker meeting. So Quakers today, I think, certainly in my own work, I've been interested in them mainly as exemplars of Parrhesia, as evangelical free speech, as a kind of speaking truth to power. And indeed, Quaker Parrhesia is quite extraordinary. It's quite inclusive. So not only are women some of the most intrepid Quaker missionaries, children too. Right? Consider young Mary Fell, who at the age of 8, writes to her local minister, William Lampett, quote, "Lampett, the plagues of God shall fall upon thee. The millstone shall fall upon thee, crush thee as dust under the Lord's feet. How can thou escape the damnation of hell?" I told you, inclusive. Such examples are sort of, the spirit of Quaker is informed by the idea of the inner light, right, in the Gospel of the Inner Light in the Gospel of John. And it's an idea that then leads to Parrhesia or free speech having a kind of priority in Quakerism that it doesn't have in other sectarian Christian faiths. So we have this incredible quote from George Fox, one of the Quaker founders. And then we also have a contemporary caricature of what a Quaker meeting then must look like. If Parrhesia is actually the name of the game, it's going to be completely anarchic, right? There's going to be no order at all. But of course, that's not actually how Quaker meetings work. It's not how they worked. The fact that there was no set clerical hierarchy didn't stop Quaker meetings from being fairly sedate affairs. There's no form, no ritual. The Gospel of the Inner Light dictates the ministry of all believers, and so there's no one leading the proceedings. But nevertheless, what ends up happening is that so-called friends, Quakers, meet together, they wait for the silence of the Holy Spirit to inspire one of the assembled to speak, and should the Spirit move, every single member of the congregation, whether they be a man, woman, or child, has the same claim to stand up and address the meeting. But as with isogoria in Athens, this claim tends to be exercised unequally, with so-called public friends, who are the most experienced, with a talent for ministry, doing most of the talking. And such people, towards the end of the 18th century, end of the 17th century, begin to be called weighty friends. Their weight does not confer any formal office or authority, but it does serve to order the proceedings and structure then the organization of the movement as a whole. And so what's most striking, I think, to the student of the history of political thought is that from the very beginning, many of the leading Quakers and public friends are women. And that the right to isogoria in the meeting, as well as the right to Parrhesia outside the meeting, belongs equally to men and women. And so in Margaret Fell's Women Speaking Justified, she puts the case really powerfully, right? Quote, "Those that speak against the woman speaking simply by reason of her sex or because she is a woman, not regarding the seed and the spirit and the power that speaks in her, such speak against Christ and his church. And as God the Father made no such difference in the first creation, nor never since between the male and the female." Thus, in the Quaker meeting, we have an example of the principle of isogoria being put into practice in a way that recalls Athens, but with the major difference that the equality of speakers' presence is not predicated on exclusion. The weightiness of certain friends does not rely on the weightlessness of others. And so to put it again in terms of the conceptual distinctions I introduced earlier, the Quaker meeting is not operating with a parity premise or indeed a sameness or identity premise. It's operating with a unity premise. We're all equal in Christ. We are all members of the body of Christ. And the head, as Margaret Fell says to her followers, the head cannot say to the feet, "I have no need of you," for everyone in their measures may be serviceable to the whole body. And because the premise was unity, not parity, I think this means that there opens up a space in the Quaker meeting for epistemic privilege to be exercised internally, not externally, as in Athenian isogoria. So basically you have a system where people have different degrees of light and different degrees of weight inside the meeting. Everyone counts, but they don't count equally, right? Privilege is accommodated. And so we have this idea that prophecy as epistemic privilege actually comes into the meeting. And again, for the students present, if you don't know these texts, they're really fascinating. I encourage you to go read up on Margaret Fell. Okay. But don't worry, Jacob, I'm finishing. Okay. So what does all this mean? What does it mean for us, especially in light of the issues that I was talking about at the very beginning? What might these historical theories and practices of isogoria teach us today about the prospects of equal speech in public? Well, in the first place, I think these examples can help us understand better some of the problems for equal speech that are presented by social media technologies like Twitter and Facebook that we fancifully describe today as platforms. From the perspective of equality as identity or sameness, technologies like Twitter are a godsend, right? All members in good standing have an equal right and opportunity to ascend to the platform and address the public. Oops. But of course, this is also the problem, because we can all speak at the same time and as much as we like, but for that very reason, precious few of us can actually get a hearing. And the principles on which audiences are allocated end up being the same old principles of wealth, virtue, or beauty. Only now, no one is forced by the limits of time and space in the body to actually listen to any speaker that they don't explicitly choose to hear. Indeed, our capacity to speak becomes divorced entirely from whether anyone else is listening at all. The connection between the claim to speak, then, and the claim to a hearing, right? The claim to getting a hearing, characteristic of the ancient platform, which is by its very nature limited in terms of its access, is finally severed. And I think this is one of many reasons why we need to think of social media platforms not as platforms, but presses, but I'm going to set that aside. Just as it was in 17th century London and in 4th century Athens, I think that for those who are interested in equal speech today, they're not actually interested in this question of distribution, because again, technology has made it easier to distribute speech equally than it ever has been before. I think the action, as ever, is on the level of our premises, not of our principles. And so one of the problems with a platform like Twitter is the feeling that even though we all have equal access to expressive opportunity, our voices simply do not count. Part of this, again, is due to the curious weightlessness of the technologies through which we can speak lightly and listen even less. But for many of us, I think we care about equality because we want our voices and other people's voices to count, to be weighty, not weightless. And the clearest path to this on offer, I think today, given existing technologies, is the path of unity then. To join ourselves to some greater whole, or to present ourselves as being somehow representative of some greater whole, by some collective, by virtue of which we can then claim some superior epistemic privilege or authority. The idea that we claim to count by virtue of being more than merely equal as a knower. And I can say more about that. But for now, I'm just going to simply observe that the issue for many of the modern day proponents of equal speech that I identified, I think, is that they want actually to avoid the unity trap, right? Instead, they want to figure out how we as a society can establish a parity of speakers under modern conditions. Not equal speech, but equal speakers. I think that's what we're after. And although a claim to epistemic privilege can often be a handy way of getting there, of getting to weight, of getting to counting, and indeed often the only way for those excluded or those at the margins, the claim to epistemic privilege is at odds with the claim to parity and the claim that every member of the public as such counts. The idea that everyone has some weight, if not the same weight. It sits uneasily with the claim that some people are epistemically privileged or possess a kind of authority. There are a few other ways that I think we can see parity at play, but I'm going to set those aside. I'm just going to conclude with then a series of uncomfortable observations. Because if what we care about, as I've argued, is parity, and what we're after today is parity, as I think it is, this means we actually have to attend to the conditions of parity The first, of course, is the condition of order, as the principle by which limited access to platforms is distributed. That order need not be hierarchical, right? But it may not be productive of internal hierarchy, but I think that there's reason to suspect, at least, that it will very often be permissive of hierarchy, or sometimes even dependent on external hierarchies that supply it with its authority. I'm not talking about prophetesses now, I'm talking about scientists or survivors. Anyway, secondly, and relatedly, turning our attention to parity means that we cannot avoid facing the issue of exclusion. I imagine that this will be the most controversial thing I'm going to say all day, so of course I've put it at the end. I think it's also one of the most obvious points. Parity depends on exclusion, on knowing who is on a par, who counts and who doesn't. If everyone counts, the system is one of sameness, not parity, and thus it is vulnerable to the leveling down objection. Now, this is not to say that in the case of isogoria, that parity's constitutive exclusions must be hierarchically ordered. We can have those included and those excluded, but make no evaluative distinctions between them. Or that those exclusions must be based on ascriptive identities or invidious distinctions of any kind. I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm simply saying, though, that it means that egalitarians need to be a lot more careful about the language of inclusion than we tend to be, and to think a lot more deeply about the institutional contexts that will be adequate and are necessary to putting equal speech into practice, rather than speaking as though the obstacle to equality is only always and everywhere a matter of just sweeping institutional barriers away. And finally, and given all this, it just seems to me, again, because I'm a navel gazer, I can't help but navel gaze, we can only put isogoria into practice publicly once we've gotten practice doing it privately. And that it's important then to protect and cultivate institutional spaces or private publics wherein people can experiment with equal speech on a condition of parity, and thus cultivate its necessary virtues. And of course, as an inveterate navel gazer, what I'm talking about often can take place inside a university, that most hierarchical of institutions, but one I think that can offer several spaces, including the seminar space, as a place where we can actually achieve conditions of parity and learn how to relate to one another as equal speakers. Now, noticing this, history can't tell us exactly how to institute these spaces such that isogoria can be revived in the modern world, but it can, I think, help us to understand which questions to ask and teach us how to listen for the answers. Thank you. So everyone tell the British Museum that I credited them. They're all here. Okay. Thanks.
The first question at RGCS Lectures is reserved for a member of the RGCS Student Fellowship, which is one of the research group's primary activities aimed at bachelor's and master's students. And I'll ask that people asking questions go up to the microphone in the aisle.
People can't wait to exclude themselves from the forum.
As always, I'm willing to be patient about this one.
Hi.
Hi.
I found your talk really interesting. I do a lot of work with women's rights and equal rights, and therefore equal speech versus free speech is a really interesting concept to me. I'm interested in your concept of equality as parity, and how you said that in parity people are different, but then of comparable value or worth. And you brought this up a little bit near the end, but I wanted to ask a question about what you think of who is able to decide who is of comparable worth and value, especially in today's environment, you know, in different situations where maybe people understand more or have more knowledge on a subject. Are they of more worth, or who gets to define worth when speaking? Yeah.
It's an excellent question. It's a really important question. I mean, this question is precisely why I want to favor a kind of plurality of private publics, because I think that the point is that the criteria are going to be different in different spaces. Different conversational communities are constituted for different ends. But the point that I find really interesting about parity is this, is the fact that it's a range property in the way that Waldron describes. I think then we can see it as, if we recognize that, we can see it operating in different institutional contexts with which we're actually pretty familiar. So obviously, the most obvious example of, getting into a university and meeting that criterion, right? Not everyone here is identical, but there is a sense in that in virtue of all getting in, you're all somehow on a par. And then that idea of parity becomes fundamental to understanding, understanding yourselves in this space. But of course, the observation that, there's a kind of arbitrariness then to any of those judgments militates in favor of there being this plurality of spaces. And I suppose, one reason that, the talk is equal speech in public, but I end with this consideration of private publics, is precisely because I think in a large-scale modern commercial democracy like this one, the idea that we can have a representative public body is dangerous and fanciful.
Thank you. That was truly delightful, to the extent that I believe you've truly earned your right to over-expressing yourself in terms of free speech by your very virtue, and even to the extent that maybe the rest of us would try to suppress our free speech in honor of your great wisdom. I address this issue of Isaac Korea. I just want to paint a different framework for thinking. Largely, throughout time, equality in speech and equality in the representation of individuals, I would say, if you look at it from the right perspective, is guaranteed in a quasi-equal manner. What separates individuals has always been the delta. I'm looking at mathematics. I'm not a mathematician, but I have a mathematical training, and that leads me to look at things in terms of points and sets. I think that's the most sensible way to look at it. So it's deltas that actually separate individuals. Deltas, and the contest for speech is not the, the conflicts between the ensemble, but the conflicts between these specific differences that seek representation in society. And as a result of these, and I'm going to reference civil rights movement at its earliest stages, in particular W.E.B. Du Bois, because he is one of the proponents of this issue of, plurality can be guaranteed or improved to some extent. Equality is a true equality through the lens of the human species. And I'm going to be very crude in expressing myself now. If we compare the equality of human beings, who are much more than 99% genetically similar to bacteria or even other species, we find tremendous equality through expression, through the mechanism of unity that you mentioned. After all, human beings do tend to subvert their own freedom to speak in favor of the Delphic oracle of their choice, and we have so many today. One in your country, Bolsonaro in Brazil. To the extent that these deltas fall in the hands often of the wrong people. I would posit there's one more in the women's rights movement. Women have had rights going back to the earliest of days, and I'll cite examples here of Deborah in the time of the judges, Jeanne d'Arc, Lucrezia. They've always had the capacity to speak, otherwise their voices would not have come out. it was always an issue of literacy that suppressed the rights of free speech through society. They could not express themselves because of that, how do you say, inability.
Right.
In our society, when we want to look at parity, how do we narrow those deltas? And this is the issue. I expect you to refute as many of my arguments as possible, but the ultimate issue that I'd like you to address is how we can converge, and we are converging, and how do we minimize those deltas as much as possible in order to have as quasi-equal an isogoric framework as possible. Thank you.
That's a big question.
It's capacious, most of mine are.
Look, one of the questions that fascinates me historically is why the idea that human beings are equal by nature is inert for so long, but I'd actually say just in general. I mean, so there's a kind of assumption that somehow equality was discovered in the 17th century, but of course that's not true. The idea that human beings are equal by nature is an ancient commonplace, right? And part of why I think that is that because the idea of equality by nature means nothing more than a species premise, that we're all equally members of the human species. Nothing follows from that. It says nothing about what we're entitled, or the idea that all humans, by virtue of their humanity, are somehow then to be treated as having some kind of positive value or high status. And so that's what I call the parity premise. The idea of natural equality only becomes effective once it's translated into a parity premise. And there's a particular story of how and why that happens in 17th century England, which is the subject of the book I'm working on. But in any case, I think just conceptually making that point is really important. But it also leads me to be kind of skeptical, I think, of the premise of much of what you were saying, which is that in order to get the parity premise going, we need effectively to minimize the difference, to minimize the delta between different groups of individuals and also different individuals. And I'm not actually sure that that's right. I mean, I think one of the amazing virtues of a tolerant liberal democracy is the fact that we can be very different. We can be very various and nevertheless maintain a sense of being on a par, being of comparable value. I am interested then in the kind of practices of equality and the practice of claiming equal status. And in that respect, I am interested in kind of the civil rights movement and also the women's rights movement. But the suggestion that somehow it's only a lack of literacy that gets in the way of women sort of effectively exercising their freedom of speech. I mean, yes and no. There are certainly institutional constraints. And so I simply point you to 1 Corinthians. Why does Paul bother going on and on about the importance of women being silent if there had not been women who were piping up? And so that kind of question, what I'd like is to understand rather than simply dismiss or apologize or excuse these kinds of making different sort of distinctions between human beings on the basis of sex. I think that there's a kind of progressivist teleology that's informed so much theoretical and historical work on the advent of equality, which really, unfortunately, has been politically important, but actually as a matter of philosophical understanding or conceptual clarity has been basically disastrous. And I just, put that question to Elizabeth Anderson when she's here in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. Institutional differences might be, for example, science. And you brought in 17th century England. I can't resist asking, what about experience? Because, science is organizing around particular claims to weight.
Yeah.
But these are very exclusive spaces, even as they are supposed to be, what humans can understand, the limits and a kind of generalizability of reason as well. I wonder if the Quakers are in dialogue with the Royal Society people.
Oh, wow. So it's a fascinating historical question, which I'm just going to punt on. I don't know enough about the overlapping circles, except, I revoke my punt, actually. So I think that there are actually just interesting considerations of networks. And so Quakers like Benjamin Furley, for instance, who is a trader and is a merchant in Rotterdam, an occasional host and friend to John Locke, is really well connected, and I think that they're more knowledgeable social and cultural historians than I can answer that to any degree of detail that you want. But yeah, I mean exactly this kinds of question about the weight of experience, and certainly in the 17th century, the idea that scientific knowledge is a kind of experiential knowledge, right? That is acquired through painstaking work. That then confers a kind of weight or judgment. I mean, it's not. It's only really in the 18th century, I think, that you get this idea that somehow the sciences of calculation are somehow going to have a kind of privilege with regard to political disagreement that then can work to sort of dissolve or dismiss political disagreement. I mean, I'm sure you know more about than I do. What's interesting to me is with the idea of parity as being the kind of premise of a system of isogoria, is that even in such a system, even those with the weight of experience are somehow still only on a par with those without. I think that's why the survivor example is also the interesting counterexample. The idea that those who've survived certain traumas have by virtue of experience a kind of superior knowledge. They know things that the rest of us don't. But there's still a sense if we're going to engage on terms of isogoria, that we can acknowledge that experience, but nevertheless not concede it any kind of authority. And all I'll just say is I think that science and trauma in a way present similar problems for democratic disagreement. And it goes back to my answer to the first question, which then is why I think we need to be very clear about different conversational contexts and in the criteria of discourse and authority in each, and be sensitive to when we're conflating, when we're sort of erasing boundaries and sort of conflating, when we're sort of when we're sort of taking for granted a kind of authority in public debate that is pertinent to other contexts. But that is just exactly the kind of question of sort of ethics, sort of, that I'm fascinated by, and that I would like theorists to tackle a lot more directly. And I think we're finally getting there. So thanks for that question.
Yes, first off, thank you so much for your talk. It's on a subject that I'm very interested in. And I was particularly, and I also want to apologize in advance for probably garbling your concepts, because you're speaking about something very finely, and I'm hoping I'm tracking it.
I had a PowerPoint.
Oh, yes, definitely. It's
very clear.
My fault, not yours. If we're thinking about parity, and you bring up the problem with Twitter, where we can all speak, but there's no guarantee of being heard. And speaking in a context of parity involves some kind of valuation of being heard. The question that pops in my head is, how do we know that we're being heard? There's one particular anecdote that's been stuck in my brain. A group of Black Lives Matter activists met with President Obama, and they spoke to him, and when they spoke to him, they said, "We just don't feel like our voices are being heard." And President Obama said, "You are sitting in the Oval Office speaking with the President of the United States. You're being heard," but the implication was, "But you're not being listened to."
Yeah.
In an increasing environment where I'm seeing this move more frequently, where to be heard is to be listened to, and to be listened to is in some sense politically to win. How does that work with your model and understanding of the value of being heard? Because I worry, would your model require us to police that side and that mistake as strongly as we police some of the other mistakes that you've discussed?
Yeah, thanks. It's an excellent question. And indeed, it's one of the questions that, motivated me initially to sort of try to say something topical with reference to historical examples. I am very sensitive to this question. And I think one of my own sort of recent experiences, just in academia and some of the kinds of controversies that have cropped up on my own campus, has been in the context of student protesters saying, you're not listening to us. And me saying, I'm listening, I'm just disagreeing. And I'm resisting your conclusions, right? And that kind of slippage from wanting to say, you know, hearing means listening and listening means affirming, I think is precisely one of the many casualties of the kind of conceptual collapse that I pointed to with those early slides on freedom of expression. I think that you could tell a similar story that way. And I think it's connected to this sense of disconnect, right? This disconnection between speaker and recipient, speech and audience, and then what kind of relationship that actually constitutes. I think that we've actually we're not really experienced anymore of hearing without affirming. I think actually we're in a kind of context where in many cases to actually choose to listen to someone is because I've already presumptively agree with that person. And so hearing is listening, is agreeing. And so there is this kind of shock, and it's a shock that I've explored in my first book with regards to civility, just the kind of the shocking disagreeableness of disagreement as a kind of, you're like, oh, right. Because, you know, there's a reason that agreeable is a synonym for pleasant. Anyway, so thank you for that. And, you know, I don't have any good answers, but I certainly say that it's a question that is motivating this inquiry.
The last question.
Okay. Thank you very much for a learned, exhilarating talk. I suppose I will grant you that ancient Athens was highly suspicious of inequality. You just have to cite the example of the ostrakon, and which is itself a stunning contrast to a decision as recently as the U.S. Supreme Court Citizens United case. What I am, though, is haunted by the objections stated facetiously by Orwell, is that in societies that pursue rigorously equality, there develops some kind of consciousness that some are more equal than others. What do you make of those, you know, the failures of the societies that were based, the socialist societies that were based on the putative search for equality?
Another big question. Thank you for it. I mean, again, speaking just for a moment generally to the larger project of which this is part, I mean, partly I'm interested in how a kind of, how a Marxist historiography of early modern England kind of assumed a certain trajectory about the progress of equality that I think then ended up certainly obscuring some of what was actually going on, but then also was closed down a kind of conceptual space for a more permissive and accommodating understanding of equality as parity, that then I think is actually in contrast to the Athenian case. So actually, I talk about Athens here because I'm interested in isogoria, but in fact, in terms of just the principle and practice of parity, I just think there are a lot of fascinating other examples in the 17th century that are the relevant contrasts and sort of frustrate or maybe surprise what we assume must be the case of an aspirationally egalitarian society as imposing a kind of Procrustean bed of everyone becoming similars, or else instituting a kind of hierarchy of the perverse hierarchy of those who are more equal than others. But to the sort of the practical question then, how do we avoid this? I think we avoid it. Certainly, I speak as a humble political theorist and as a humble teacher who is master only of my own domain if that. I think we avoid it by attending to the sites of equality to which we have of quality as parity to which we have access and over which we have some control and duties of stewardship and guardianship. And so I'm fascinated by how practices of equality in particular sites, be they the Quaker meeting, be they the Digger commune, be they the courtroom, in terms of leveler protests in favor of jury, the rights of jurors, sites of equality to make the premise of parity plausible. It actually goes back to your other very big question, right? We have to have the experience of the plausibility of parity to relating to each other as peers or equals in the midst of our differences in order to make it possible to hold that thought in our head. Because in fact, you know, maybe this will be the second most controversial thing I'll say, but actually I think most of you agree with me. Equality is not obvious. It's really counterintuitive, right? The idea that for all of our differences, we're somehow on a par in this way, that's an idea that has to be it has to be discovered, it has to be instituted, and it has to be maintained and preserved. And that means that there's a kind of practical demand and an ethical demand to attend to these spaces. I mean, there I sort of find myself on the side of, I mean, Hannah Arendt gets a lot of stick from people like Jeremy Waldron, but I think Arendt is just right about how equality as parity works. That's not her term, but she's talking about equality. But I think she's right, and I think that insight needs to be regained. And also made less, maybe, I mean, this is just, now I'm going to say something really terrible, maybe made less partisan. Because I actually think then, I mean, this is what I'm gesturing towards with the idea of we need to take order, hierarchy, and exclusion seriously. I actually think that, you know, equality depends on institutions. And institutions can't be maintained on a purely partisan basis. And I think that is, again, to gaze at my navel, a problem facing the modern university, certainly in my own country. But there I will actually, now it's the mic drop, so no more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please bear with me for a couple of minutes of closing business before I'll invite everyone to join us for a reception in the next room. Those who are going to dinner, please leave the reception and move to the foyer outside those doors at 6:40. When we stop now, before moving to the reception, I'll ask that RGCS associated faculty come join me up here for a moment for pictures with Professor Bejan. Well, this concludes the public programming for RGCS for the year. It's not the complete end of RGCS's activities. There will again be a research group on constitutional studies student writing prize awarded in the spring for the best substantial piece of academic writing by an arts undergraduate on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society. And I'd like to draw this to the attention of students who are allowed to self-nominate and of faculty who teach art undergraduates who are strongly encouraged to nominate papers. Please keep an eye out for those, for that call for nominations. I'll remind you again that Elizabeth Anderson's Jan P. Lind Center annual lecture will be given 2 weeks from today in the McGill Faculty Club. And if you would like to attend, please register for that by emailing lindcenter@mcgill.ca, lindcenter, all one word, @mcgill.ca. And we're going to give away a copy of Mere Civility to a student who registered for the talk and is here in attendance, of whom there are 79, which is a convenient number. 53. Number 53 is Jackie Lee. Jackie, are you here? Great. Yes. And with that, the business is concluded. Faculty, please join up here. Everyone, the reception is next door. And please join me in thanking Teresa Bejan.